Moshe Taragin here for the OU All Parsha video series from Gush Etzion. Parshas Vaetchanan. I'm recording a little bit early. Don't want to get the week backlog, so I'm still with my 3 weeks morning Avelis, not beard, but stubble. And of course, Parshas Vaetchanan is the second moment that we see Moshe Rabbeinu yearning and pining, longing and coveting, entering Eretz Yisrael. And the final sentence is handed down, the verdict is finalized, and Moshe Rabbeinu then directs his attention to his famous soliloquy and his Mishnah Torah. Of course, it may not be happening in Vaetchanan. All of Sefer Devarim perhaps is Moshe's retrospective towards the end of his life, and he's referring to his tefillos that he had davened beforehand. As, all of Sefer Devarim is referring to past events. Now, when Moshe describes himself as having davened for Eretz Yisrael, he recites that he had asked Hashem to pass through the land to see the beautiful country, on the other side of the Jordan River. Of course, he's standing on the east bank, so he wants to travel to the west bank. Not the west bank, as people call it today, but the west bank of the Jordan, which is Eretz Canaan. Hahar hatov hazeh v'halevanon. Or at least areas in Levanon which were part of Eretz Yisrael all the way up north. So he's stretching the boundaries of what he wants to see. But Onkelos already, because of the juxtaposition between Hahar HaTov Hazeh, the Levanon, assumes that the word Levanon is a nickname for the Beis HaMikdash. So Moshe's real interest is not just the entire Eretz Canaan, but in particular the Makom HaMikdash, Hahar HaTov Hazeh, the Levanon. Now, what Onkelos, of course, doesn't explain is why is the Mikdash referred to as Levanon. So, again, the simple reason, it's not a simple reason because it's not a simple meaning, is that the Beis HaMikdash is referred to as Levanon because it's tall and imposing, the same way the trees that are so famously associated, Arzei Levanon, with the area of Levanon, there's beauty, there are trees, they're tall. But our Chazal and the Medrash developed 2 different ideas as to why the Beis HaMikdash is referred to by the nickname of Levanon. The Beis HaMikdash has many nicknames. It's Ariel, it's Beis Hashem, it's Har HaMoriah. Why is it referred to as Levanon? And of course, the real question is, why does Moshe use this term as opposed to some of the other nicknames? And he doesn't use the term Yerushalayim, because that doesn't appear in the Torah, it appears in Tanakh. And what does this term Levanon mean for Moshe at this stage of his life? And what does the term Levanon mean for us? And what does it mean literally? What does it mean metaphorically? So there's a lot to talk about. So the Medrash has 2 different opinions. Rav Shimon Bar Yochai actually associates the Beis HaMikdash with Levanon because Levanon conjures the 3-letter root of Lamed Bet Nun, which is white. And the Beis HaMikdash whitened our sins because it was the epicenter of Korban Chatas, but again, I don't think the Medrash means specifically Korban Chatas, that's just the hitch. That's just the way to associate Levanon with this function of the Mikdash of Korbanos, because one Korban has a whitening effect, but all the Korbanos are brought in the Beis HaMikdash, and all Korbanos are created equal. Obviously, if they're not, there's Kachikachim and Kachikalim, but certainly Chatas and Anola, in this context, are indistinguishable. But Moshe Rabbeinu desired to see the Makom HaMikdash as a makom of avodas hamikdash and kohanim and karbanos and omed lifnei Hashem. Rav Tivyumi doesn't appear too much in Shas with halachos, but he is someone who appears often in the Medrash. Tes Beis Yud Vav Mem Yud. Tivyumi says that the word Levanon comes from the 2-letter root of Lamed Beis, of Lev, and it's a place where all the hearts of the Jewish people are happy in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, this isn't referring to Karbanos, it's referring to a place that everyone yearns for, is happy to be together in, is Ola Regel 2, the Rambam in the beginning of Beis HaBechira. I don't have it in front of me, but he defines the 2 different roles of the Beis HaMikdash, the primary functions. One is for Karbanos, and one is a place that people rally to. Aliyah L'Regel wasn't primarily a gathering of ritual and of mitzvahs. It was a national gathering. Of course, there were mitzvahs that were performed, their korbanos sibor. People presumably brought the nidarim and nidavos, the korbanos that they had pledged throughout the year. The bikurim were brought if it's Shavuos or Sukkos. Can't be brought on Pesach, obviously. So Meister Sheni's probably bought, bikurim is brought, but the shell, the framework, the overall context is people gathering together and celebrating national identity. And what Reb Shimon Bar Yochai describes as Levanon, as the Makom HaMikdash captured by Levanon, and what Rav Tzvi captures within the word Levanon, are two very different functions, not just of the Beis HaMikdash, but two very different functions for a place, and not just for a place, for a leader. And I think this is why Moshe, at the end of his life, sees the Beis HaMikdash through this word Levanon, which captures both because it's reflective of the two dual functions of his life. On the one hand, the Beis HaMikdash is a place for hierarchy and kohanim, and there's an exclusivity to the Beis HaMikdash. Not everyone can enter equally. If you're a Kohen, you can enter certain locations. If you're a Kohen Gadol, you can enter certain locations, and not only once a year in Levim and Machne Levi and Machne Yisrael. And it's not just space and where you stand, but it's a place in which your mitzvos and the level of your mitzvos and the degree of your karbanos and the degree of your connection to Kadosh Baruch Hu is carefully graded. Not that people are handing out grades, but it makes a difference, and it will affect the caliber of the karban, because these are karbanos and ceremonies that depend upon the virtue of the person and the sincerity of the intention and the not the validity, but the superiority and the caliber of the karban. Karban al-v'yared, again, it's not that a Kadosh Baruch Hu judges caliber based on financial investment, but certainly based on how much of your nefesh you insert into the karban. Whereas the other term of Levanon is much more democratic, national, encompassing. The entire people are happy when they think about Yerushalayim. Their hearts all float. Their imaginations all migrate to Yerushalayim. They come 3 times a year to be together, to be non-differentiated, not to highlight differences, just to all stand together in Yerushalayim. And it is more of a common moment, not a moment of religion and ritual and mitzvahs, but more national identity. And national identity is much more of an equalizer. And Moshe Rabbeinu's life was a combination and a blend of these two. He was the Ish Elokim. He went to Shamayim. He didn't eat and drink. He heard the voice of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He fought with the Malachim. He learned Torah with the Rebbeinu Shalom. I mean, taught Torah to Am Yisrael. He's a Melech HaKol Yisrael. It's hard to imagine someone with more of a transcendent, surpassing, rarefied spiritual experience. Yet, Moshe is also someone that has a soft spot for the average, simple, as we would say, Pashut Jew. And you already see this, I think, before he becomes Moshe Rabbeinu. He's so disturbed that 2 Jews could be acting aggressively towards one another. And you see this in Chazal's Medrash that Moshe campaigns on behalf of the Erev Rav, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, we don't really want those people. And Moshe, quote-unquote, convinces HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You see this in Parshas Yisro, and the patience Moshe displays in handling the needs of an entire young nation, even to the point of self-annihilation, and his father-in-law is worried sick. You see this in Parsha Kitisa, where he's willing to fall on the sword. You see this in the end of Parsha Kitisa, the end of Parsha Kitisa, where the nation is in such a fallen state that he moves his tent out of the radius of the camp, because he had been living amongst them, and Aaron censures him for that, because that's not what they need from you. And more as he grows, you see very famous Gemara where he comes up to Shemayim and Erevin Chavbeis. He comes up to Shemayim during the Egel, and he's surprised at Hashem's Erech HaPayim. You should just be someone who is tolerant for tzaddikim, not for Rishayim. And then Moshe learns his lesson in Parsha Shlach, where he realizes that Rishayim need HaKadosh Baruch Hu's mercy equivalently or equally or even more so, and therefore he realizes it's not Erech HaPayim, but Erech HaPayim. And to me, I think even, I'm very intrigued by the new Moshe 40 years later, because he's no longer... Remember, he was always an older person. He's always in his 80s during Yetzias Mitzrayim. But those days, 80 was the new 40, was the old 40, because people lived to 120. So I don't care how physically intact they were, but you weren't at the end of life. Now Moshe is at the end of life at 120. And of course, he's very active. Lo naslecho, the Torah itself tells us. But you can't help but seeing him. He's a different generation. And I wonder about Moshe, not the father of the people, but as he describes himself, or as a mother in Parshas Baloscha, but as a grandfather. And at least between the cracks, I detect a softer Moshe. I detect a grandfather Moshe, Zaidi Moshe, a Moshe who is able to work through complaints and crisis, Benot Salavchad, Reuven and Gad, the people of Menashe, Moshe who is, I would say, a softer version of himself, more tolerant, and that's why, and the contrast between the Moshe in the end of the second year who receives his sentence because he's intolerant, because he's quick to anger, and Moshe doesn't blow his fuse that deeply. He's angry in Parshas Matos, but so Moshe Rabbeinu's life is a combination of a leader who's meant to inspire and challenge and raise the spiritual level and set a spiritual standard, but also someone who's a unifying force and can serve as a rallying point himself for people of very different hearts and very different levels, as he himself describes leadership in Parshas Pinchas, Yifkod Hashem Elokei Ruchos, that people are different. And that term Levanon captures those two parts of Moshe, and it captures the two parts of what we try to build when we build communities. When I say communities, I don't just mean locations and geographies, I mean groups. Whenever we assemble groups, do we shoot for the stars and create exclusive groups because we want to maintain a certain level? Or do we stretch and try to be as inclusive as possible? And for many years, when I would be interviewing boys for the yeshiva, so very often I'd get the question, well, Rebbe, where are the shtark boys going next year? And is this a shtark yeshiva? And shtark in Yiddish meaning strong. And I try to question the assumption, because the assumption is that a shtark is a better yeshiva. To me, that's not my goal of yeshiva, to assemble the shtarkiest boys and to press the button and let them learn. I want to try to gather as much of Am Yisrael as I can under one roof, around one campfire, and let different people take what they can from the heat of Torah, from the light of Torah. And the challenge is, how do you create that diversity without the center falling in? You can create unlimited diversity and unlimited differences and accept everyone. But I think that's a challenge that we all want to face when we build shuls and communities and yeshivos and other organizations and whatever political parties. How can we stretch and stretch and stretch and be as inclusive and inclusive and inclusive, but still maintain the core of who we are? It's something that excites me about chinuch, and it's something that excites me about being in Eretz Yisrael, where there is such a diversity, and being in Hezbollah Yeshiva, which by definition, and being in the type of Hezbollah Yeshiva that I teach in, which is an international destination yeshiva, and we have boys from literally all over the world. And obviously, when you take boys from literally 8 or 9 different countries, the coding is going to be different, and you're going to have to flex the yeshiva to create a space, a safe space, or a comforting space, and you're not going to be able to prod or push one particular level, because levels is very culturally contextual. And to me, this duality of Levanon isn't just a biography or a retrospective of Moshe's life, it's how we see the Beis HaMikdash, and the Beis HaMikdash is a metaphor for how we see building organizations and groupings amongst our people. And of course, it also refers to, I would say, and again, I think that before I talk about the literal application, I think that the Ashkenazi community has veered one way and the Sephardic community has remained in a different place. I think the Ashkenazi community, because of a range of different phenomena that occurred between 1800 and the year 2000. If you want to see what the Ashkenazi community was like in the year 1800, just look at the Sephardic community. There weren't groups, there weren't ideologies, there weren't shtark and no shtark, there wasn't in and out, there wasn't who are the good people, who are the bums, who are the oisvarvs, who are the... It was just a large community, or small shtetls, and everyone stood next to each other and davened next to each other and lived with one another, and people had differences and levels of commitment, and there weren't issues that were made about that. And so many revolutions affected the Ashkenazi world between the year 1800 and the year 2000. The Yeshiva movement, the Musar movement, Hasidus, Reformed, Conservative, and even more an anarchic, Bundist, socialist, Marxist, and of course the Holocaust, which deeply, deeply seared Jewish consciousness, which more or less skipped over the Sephardic world. So the Sephardic world, and those of you who live in Israel, you just feel much more embraced, and you see a model of embracing and inclusion. The Ashkenazi world, I think, still marches to that drumbeat. Certainly in the Haredi sector, and it's something that came from a Haredi world. It was something that I've thought a lot about. Is I certainly felt, maybe it's not true anymore, I don't live in that community, but I certainly felt that when I was being educated, there were haves and have-nots and ins and outs, and if you're in, you're in, if you're out, you're out, and if you follow, you don't follow, and there's a certain coding, and to me, it's just not how my heart beats. It doesn't make it better or worse. My heart beats to the rhythm of inclusion and the rhythm of trying to create bridges and bring people together and unify. And that's why one of the reasons I feel very comfortable living where I live, because it's an ethos that I feel very, very driven by. And of course, the duality of Levanon and the Beis HaMikdash is not just a metaphor for Moshe's career or a metaphor for inclusion and exclusion in organizations that we construct, but literally about the Beis HaMikdash. And of course, we don't yet have the Beis HaMikdash. And one day, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this is Erev Tisha B'Av, will deliver the Beis HaMikdash, and He alone can combine these two poles of a makom of avodas Hashem, and of surpassing commitment and piety and hierarchy and transcendence, and also a place that people of different levels can rally around and jointly experience. But until then, we do have a remnant of the Beis HaMikdash, and this has been the elusive challenge and dilemma. It's called the Kotel, and the Kotel lies right on the edge between these two poles. Because on the one hand, we want it to be a makom tefillah. We want to preserve it as a makom tefillah. How could you imagine the Kotel not enabling tefillah? So it wants to be a holy and sacred place, and at a halachic level, it has to be a mechitzah and division between men and women. But it's probably one of the last remaining unifiers across the entire spectrum. I've spoken a lot about Har Herzl and how I think people should visit Har Herzl, and it is a unifying feature, but unfortunately for those who aren't identified and incorporated with Army life, Har Herzl, again, if you have a family member or you visit on your own, but it doesn't carry the same impact for people who are disengaged from Army and disengaged from conscription that it does for our community and the secular community. And the Kotel really does. The Kotel captures the imagination of every single Jew across the entire spectrum. And not just across the entire spectrum in Israel, across the entire Jewish world. Who goes to Israel without visiting the Kotel? And how can we create a Kotel that serves as a rallying point for the hearts of every single Jew, while still maintaining it as a makom of tefillah and makom of korbanos? How can it be a malbin? How can it be a ritual location? How can it also be shekol? What's the lashon of Yumei shekol halevav smeichim bo? I think we blew it. Sharansky tried a few years ago to find a solution. I think there would be solutions. I think there's a general hesitation amongst the Orthodox, certainly certain groups of Orthodoxy. If you give an inch, they'll take a foot. I remember the Kotel is a really big place, and you could, in theory, create spaces for tefillah and spaces for a national gathering and assembly and joint peoplehood. It's sad. There's no finger pointing. A, it's not going to help. B, it's hard to find. There's such a labyrinth of issues. But when you read Moshe Rabbeinu and Parshas Vaetchanan referring to the Beis HaMikdash as Levanon, and you hear Chazal identifying these two components of Levanon and they're diametrically opposed, you're seeing the two different components and features of Moshe's life and career, which only Moshe could pull off. But you're also seeing two different models for building organizations. And we have the luxury of having multiple organizations. We don't have the luxury of having multiple Kotels. So we have to pull off that magic act that only HaKadosh Baruch Hu can, and we wait for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But until then, we have to do better in creating a place that is transcendent, holy, sacred, korbanos tefillah, but also is kol halavavos smeichim bo.